TSMC takes Arizona. How's it going? To discuss, I have on today Viola Zhou, writer at Rest of World, who recently published a gripping feature about the cultural challenges the leading global foundry is working to overcome to start manufacturing in the US. Throughout her story, we get a peek into a world of rigid hierarchies, slow on the uptake Americans, and pornographic desktop wallpapers, as well as a quote for the ages to describe the greater Phoenix area, as well as perhaps all of America. 好山好水好无聊, or great mountains, great rivers, and great boredom. We'll also get into another fantastic feature she did in late 2023, exploring Foxconn's quest to make the iPhone in India. So a theme of Taiwanese firms trying to strike it out big into the wider non-East Asian world. Viola, you're doing real reporting. This is great. You don't get to see that every day on the internet. Thanks so much for this fantastic piece, and welcome to ChinaTalk.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I love your teaser. And there are many people doing real journalism, and I'm honored to be one of them.
So let's start with TSMC. You ended up talking to over 20 current and former employees, both Americans and Taiwanese. Walk us through the reporting process for a story like this.
I think 4 months ago, I had the idea actually when I was reporting on Foxconn. I remember I was asking the Foxconn managers, do you know any TSMC people? Because they are in Taiwan, I think they are part of the same circle. And then usually the engineers have other engineer friends. And because I was just like, I know I knew they had a factory in America, and I felt there must be some story there. I didn't know what the story was. So I think late last year, 4 or 5 months ago, I started to, when I had time, like casually messaging people on LinkedIn, trying to talk to some engineers. I kind of like targeted American engineers first because it's just like harder to find Taiwanese engineers. A lot of them, they're not active on LinkedIn, or like they didn't have public profiles. I had no idea what the story was. The only thing I knew was like they spent time in Taiwan, because some people, they wrote on their profile page that, oh, I spent 2 years in Taiwan. I even learned some Mandarin. And then I felt, oh, that sounds pretty interesting. Maybe we can do a cute cultural stories about their, like, basically exchange life in Taiwan. And when I got my first source, that's why I kind of had the idea what the story would be. He sent me really, really long answers about actually like what he would describe as actually a lot of problems with Taiwanese work culture. They sounded very frustrated. They talk about all the like inefficiencies, like the very harsh military style management. So basically it was like a long complaint. And I was like actually so shocked, because when I was like reading Taiwanese media, TSMC was always like so glorified. There was like hardly any negative coverage about the company in the Taiwanese or like in the Chinese speaking media world. People talk about how intense it was, but it seems like the messaging was always the intensity was the reason behind its success. Like even the intensity was glorified, was much praised, that we worked so hard, that's why we succeeded. That was always the idea. So when I first heard the perspective from the Americans, I was really surprised, and I knew there was a story, and I just needed more people.
So it's always tricky with these stories, right? Because like the employees that are willing to talk to the Violas in the world are also tend to be the ones that are grumpy enough to write multi-paragraph responses to one sentence questions. And it's always tricky. Like, I think there's sort of like a baseline expectation in any of this stuff, right? that like a foreign company coming to the US is going to have some of these challenges. Like, you saw this in the 80s with Japan manufacturing cars in the US. And you obviously, see it basically anywhere, like Taiwan and Foxconn, like Foxconn and in India, for instance, especially if you're going kind of like, the further out of the like concentric cultural circles you get from a nationality perspective, the more you have to like overcome and change from a management style. So, it's interesting starting with with the coverage in Taiwanese media being like, oh yeah, this is just another day in the park and maybe we're like 10% more intense because like, it's interesting with a lot of these stories, like the baseline of what is normal and accepted in Taiwan, kind of running into, what is normal and accepted in another country. And there's like going to be a kind of learning and adjustment process, for any firm. But I think the TSMC one, just because like the stakes are so high and I don't know, maybe like the class is so interesting, just makes it particularly entertaining.
Yeah, I think in both TSMC and Foxconn's case, there was like a sudden geopolitical change that was pushing this. It wasn't, this move wasn't like pushed by or like motivated by purely commercial economic considerations. That's why I think we saw like more dramatic things happening in this context.
Because it's interesting that both of them are like unnatural fits, that would not be happening if it wasn't for geopolitics. And it's more expensive to make the iPhone in India than it is in Zhengzhou. It's more expensive to make chips in the US than it is in Taiwan, but like the companies kind of have to do it, for this, that, and the other region, which we cover a lot on other episodes of ChinaTalk. We don't need to get into here, but it's sort of is pushing firms further out of their comfort zone to go faster than they would otherwise. But yeah, all right. So let's continue with the narrative story. You get this one grumpy American. It's there's some good meat here. So how do you continue to unravel the mystery of what goes on in TSMC Arizona?
Yeah, so I just about like spending a lot of time trying to get more people to talk. Yeah, like I agree that I think the first people that a journalist would find when they got into like a news story like this tend to be some like a grumpy employee. But I think as we get deeper, as we started to talk more people, actually I started to get a spectrum of different opinions. And also that's why like being on the ground is so important. I made a trip to Arizona in February. And then there like very interestingly, because there are so few East Asian people living, like you can yeah, like just like by walking on the streets, if you bumped into like East Asian looking young man, usually 90% or even 90% of the chance they are TSMC engineers. And then they're not grumpy employees. They're like it's a pretty good sample size. You just like bump into people and ask what their thoughts are.
All right, so let's structure the conversation. Why don't we talk about the Chinese and Taiwanese experience in Phoenix and India, and then we'll talk about the sort of Americans at the plant and then the Indians at the plant. So, all right, so we have the Taiwanese. They signed this deal to start building in Arizona. We have COVID hitting, but then all of a sudden, like we're now at the point where we have 1,100 or so Taiwanese who are helping stand up this factory. Talk a little bit about their experience. What aspects of it, maybe less from a work side, but from a culture side, struck out most of them about moving to the U.S.
It's the great boredom. When I got to Phoenix myself, I just moved to New York City not very long ago. And before that, I was in Hong Kong, and I traveled to Taipei a few times. So I was more used to this like East Asian big cities, and even like New York City, I think is even like OIC is like more similar to Taipei than compared with like Phoenix. So I got to Phoenix. I was asking all the Taiwanese people there, this place is so boring. Why did you come here? So it was like really the opposite of Taipei, of like all the Taiwanese cities. The food is like, I don't want to offend Americans. I feel there are very limited options. That is in no way compares to what you get in Taiwan. Transportation, there's no public transportation. There's no proper malls. There are like nowhere where people could hang out. Like all the like restaurants, like coffee shops, they are like mostly like chain stores, like Starbucks, IHOP, Chipotle. Um, yeah. So like I think that is their biggest culture shock. In some way the life become very inconvenient.
One thing I'll say in favor of Phoenix is it has Waymo. So that's something you don't get in Taipei. Autonomous driving vehicles. But yeah, having spent maybe 7 days there a week ago, I will say it is very pretty. It can get very hot. It is also a lot of suburban sprawl, which takes some loving, and particularly if you're not like super into like desert exploration, it may be tricky. But all right, so I think the experience of the Chinese managers, that was almost like a more classic like show up in a developing country story and like have no interest in exploring any of it. I presume the expectations were like relatively low going in, and you have the classic stuff of them like bringing lots of their own food and having a special chef and living in a compound. But those poor Taiwanese thinking that America was all that, and then they show up and they're just like living this suburban lifestyle is kind of brutal. Well, I guess what was interesting also is there's this like added selling point of bringing your family to the US. You talked about people timing pregnancies to make sure that their newborns had citizenship. What was the sort of like schooling and integration with more English in their life from a lifestyle perspective, at least, like for those Taiwanese engineers?
Right. So yeah, I think the biggest advantage, the biggest selling point of Phoenix is it's in America. And I think people would all agree if you have children growing up in America, if you have babies who are born with American citizenships, and I totally agree with the person quoted in the article that they will have more options coming up. They will be able to and then this story is a proof of that. Instead of working for TSMC, you can work for like American tech companies with much better work-life balance when your children are growing up. So yeah, so like a lot of people cited the children's education as the main reason that they took up the jobs. Some of them, there are like local media reports about local primary schools offering special, maybe like Mandarin visual aids, or like they have like certain English as a second language programs just for the Taiwanese students. Some of them, they are like teenagers in high school. They're attending American high school. I bumped into a teenage girl who is attending American high school, and then she is a child of like 2 TSMC employees. So like both of her parents work at TSMC, and then she said like she's doing great, like integrating well. She really wanted to come to America. That's why she actually asked her parents to take the opportunities to come here. And then they have, because there are like so many Taiwanese children right now, they have their own community. They go out together on weekends. This person is dating another TSMC kid. So it's like a mini TSMC community now growing in Phoenix.
Okay, so you got your kid in high school. You're kind of bored, but going hiking on the weekends. You're working really hard, and all of a sudden you got to deal with these like really annoying Waiworen. what how has it been from the experience of your mid-level TSMC engineer dealing with all these foreign employees for the first time?
The thing they noticed very early on is that Americans get off work on time. They get off work at 5 p.m. Some of them, they're like, um, yeah, like they actually work 8 hours. So like I think this is a very big shock to them, and they also talk about how Americans, they are more likely to challenge the orders they are given. Like, oh, we tell you to do this, and then they will ask why, and then you have to explain to them. And then sometimes they are not convinced, so like they don't want to do this thing that you ask them to do. So like they just like complain a lot, challenge a lot. Oh, I think one person mentioned that it's not in the story, but like they mentioned like, oh, in America, people actually eat lunch or like eat snacks during meetings. That they have never seen it happening in Taiwan. And in America, people call like their managers like by name, but in Taiwan, it's commonly you call them like 长官. It's a very military term. That's and then or like you call your managers like sir. So I think overall they just feel like Americans are hard to manage, and it seems that they don't do as much as Taiwanese people. And then overall, it becomes like a vicious circle. Like at first, like Americans, they don't get proper training. They have language barriers. And then later, the manager will feel like, oh, they're like so mafan to deal with them. I would rather just assign this task to Taiwanese people. So it seems like there are like two worlds going on. That Americans, they're always like getting away with things, but Taiwanese people, they're like having their tasks piling up. So that's where like I feel like some people, they started to get annoyed with like working with Americans.
Yeah, I love this. I love this quote. Very simple. It's hard to get them to do things. Like, totally understand. Like, I'm sure it is, and I'm sure it's really annoying if you've, been able to work with the pick of the litter in Taiwan, and have incredibly dedicated employees and be able to pay top dollar to get the best graduates who aren't daydreaming about another job and are not having to compete with like Walmart and Amazon and whatever else. And yeah, I'm sure it's super frustrating. And then I love the bit like where the Kumamoto plant launches up and then a Taiwanese engineer goes, the Japan factory opened first. I'm very frustrated. It's like, they were really trying to do the thing. And it's clear that there were some construction challenges, some labor challenges. I'm sure permitting challenges as well, which maybe you didn't have to deal with in Japan. That got them that got them further. But all right. So let's come to the American side, because I can also very much empathize as a foreigner who's worked in Chinese workplace environments, that there's a whole lot of BS that happens that maybe actually isn't so great for productivity in the long run. Talk about why the Americans who ended up working with TSMC, what were their motivation and sort of initial interactions with the company.
Yeah, so like actually a lot of this remind me of Chinese tech companies. Even though they're like in two different places, but like a lot of the practices, such as writing weekly reports about what you have done over that week, or like making PowerPoints, and then just like regularly you have to make presentations, and it's just like very strict controls. You have to do whatever your bosses tell you to do. And then you have to stay behind even though you have finished your work. All these things, like they are like I feel quite standard for maybe an Asian workplace. But yeah, I can totally see why Americans feel very frustrated by all these things that have nothing to do with what you actually produce. And then adding to it is the language barrier. They don't feel like they're actually properly learning the thing that they want to learn, which is like making semiconductors. Yeah, I love the part where this person said they had to like hand copy Chinese characters to translate them because you cannot upload the production materials to Google Translate. I can't imagine how that would work for a foreigner. You like basically like you were like drawing and then it's about like making semiconductors. So yeah, it's like the company was just really really underprepared to in terms of like in terms of like management, in terms of culture, in terms of like overcoming language barriers. Yeah, they were like not prepared to receive like a global workforce.
Yeah. I don't know. As the like third foreign passport holding person in a large Chinese tech firm back in Kuaishou, like I get it. And it's also the sort of thing where like I'm sure there was some bureaucratic dynamics where like, you have this like decision made by the highest levels of management. And, is Mark Leo going to be the one to make sure that you have some translation? Like, absolutely not. And is the 45-year-old going to be super excited about, doing this project that's not going to come online in 2026 when, there's 10 other things that are prioritized. It's interesting because I think some of the things were clear that are kind of like growing pains and the sorts of things that are ultimately going to be overcome, and there are other bits that are a little more concerning, I guess, if I was a shareholder of TSMC, like when someone said, I'd ask my manager what's your priority, and he'd always say everything is a priority. Or you have these 5 former employees talking about how TSMC engineers, quote, sometimes falsified or cherry-picked data for customers or managers, manipulating data from testing tools or wafers to please managers who had seemingly impossible expectations. And look, it's hard to know exactly how much to make of this sort of thing because, like, TSMC is the best company in the world at doing this, right? So, like, something is going right with all of this, from a American's perspective, like difficult and overweening management style. I do think I guess my hope is that come 5 years from now we'll have some like happy synthesis where the Taiwanese engineers will get to lead better lives, having learned that they can like chill out and still make badass chips, thanks to some of the more Western, I guess, approaches to dealing with management about these sorts of things.
Yeah, like maybe like to give it more context, especially on the accusation about falsifying data. I did ask the engineers. I was like, how does it work? Like you falsify data, and then does it impact the quality of the actual chips? And I think from their answers, I got the impression that it's actually a lot of it is bad management. Engineers, they're humans. They're supposed to like make the call, like what kind of data we need, or like what kind of measurements we should hit, in order for something to work. I'm no expert in actual like engineering, but like, I feel what they say is like sometimes managers ask for something, we have to hit this data, for us to pass this stage maybe, and then the engineers themselves, they would think that first it's impossible for us to get there. We have no time. We don't have the capacity to collect this much data or like to reach that bar at the time. But at the same time, it's like we don't need to hit that bar to sorry, I don't know how to describe this. Like, yeah, some of them, they would say like we don't need to hit that data. We don't need that much data for this to work. That's when they started to maybe like manipulate data. I think I've heard similar stories in Chinese companies as well. It's like not everything eventually ended up in the actual products, but a lot of things, a lot of efforts have wasted in kind of like navigating the bureaucracy or like making your managers happy.
Yeah, I mean it's funny, right? Because there's like 上有政策,下有对策, but there's the
Yeah,
American
exactly.
version of that, and then there's like the Taiwanese version of that, right? Like the American version would be like, is prioritizing, going home early, but the Taiwanese one would like be cool playing video games on your phone for 2 hours from like 2 to 5 p.m., but like you can't leave before 8. And it's the same thing with this management thing. Like the way that Americans would deal with some BS requirement from their boss would be to tell them it's a BS requirement. The way the Taiwanese are dealing with it is by just making up some fake numbers, and the boss is too busy or like kind of knows themselves that they don't really care about it. And it's not that important. So it's gonna be, be taken away, be dealt with one way or another in the long. So, the proof is in the pudding, right? TSMC is not some like broken state-owned enterprise. They're an incredibly competitive, successful firm, and have like a fair amount of faith that this is the sort of thing which is going to be ironed out eventually. But it's really difficult to do this sort of international expansion in manufacturing, and it does take real time to kind of get the gears going and really start to iron out some of these cultural kinks.
Yeah. I think you know this firsthand as someone who has actually worked in Chinese tech companies. Yeah, and then I do think if they want, they can adapt over time. But I think one of the experts also pointed out that do they really have the incentive to transform their management style just for this American factory? I think it depends on eventually how much chips does the US government want them to produce in America. If it's like a small amount, maybe they're just like take losses, having it run fairly, maybe like slowly, like they can just like absorb the extra cost. But if it needs to be like an actual efficiently run, profitable factory in the long run, they do need to figure out a better way to retain the American workers so they don't keep like looking for jobs at Intel.
The best alternative option to working at the factory seems to me to be the key difference between what you saw in India and what you saw in the US. Because in America, like, look, like these are hard jobs. You're wearing a bunny suit. You have to work under these sort of new strange conditions. And like, I don't know, there's like 3.5% unemployment. Like there's plenty of other opportunities for a lot of people. And it's not like that, these jobs are necessarily like paying top dollar, like what you could see in the Taiwanese context. But, when you look at India, it's sort of like China in the 1980s, right? Where you have factory women who all of a sudden are like liberated from these awful patriarchies, but by being able to make money on their own, and they can live independent lives. And look, if that means you have to like learn how to use a tweezers all day, or you have to live in barracks, or you got to get used to dealing with air conditioning, having lived in a tropical climate all your life, like you're gonna suck it up and make do, because this factory job is so much better than just I don't know, living under some man who beats you in the countryside, or being a farmer who lives and dies based on the weather or something.
Yeah, I feel like to some extent, like even though like Foxconn makes less money in India, this move maybe like follows the economic logic more naturally. Probably it's something that will eventually happen because of the low labor cost, because it is cheaper to hire workers in India. It's just like the supplier network is not ready yet. So I think the geopolitics is I think geopolitics are accelerating the process a little bit, that, you have to move them now. But yeah, we did see in India kind of like similar things that happened in China 30, 40 years ago, that women, they are coming out of villages for the very first time and then taking up factory jobs. And then they can do very hard works with relatively low pay. That was... But the move to America, probably it would never happen without politics.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's not necessarily the case. Like, I think there's look, you have the CHIPS Act subsidies, you have the vast majority of TSMC's clients are based in America, right? So the design firms, it's kind of nicer to fly to Phoenix just to fly all the way from Cupertino to Taiwan. So, I think there are other kind of logics going on. And the other thing that's important to remember about TSMC, right, is like semiconductors are a global industry, and there are different pieces. There are different like pieces of the TSMC as an organization that have to collaborate with, all the semiconductor equipment manufacturers, and have to do sales to Nvidia and Apple and everyone else. So, this is an international organization on some dimensions, and they've been able to do that very successfully. But manufacturing has basically been entirely within East Asia, and that is kind of the big jump. And I think it's I tweeted about about Viola's thing, which kind of blew up a little bit. And one of the interesting emails I got was someone being like, "Look, when you look at like a Samsung or a Huawei that has to sell products internationally, like they've been at this earlier and more often. And, they have all these training programs where they send people abroad and have them learn, local languages and establish relationships and go to schools outside of, Korea or China, as the case may be. And, this is like a process and a story. Maybe I'll go back and find some guy who worked at Hyundai in the 80s or Toyota or something to get that arc too, because there are a lot of similar parallels there between
No, I was just saying, like, I got an email from an engineer who works in semiconductor in the US in the 70s, I think. I also like heard it from someone else who is more part of the older generation of semiconductor engineers. And then they said it was the same in the US 30 years ago. Back then at Intel, at Texas Instruments, we were also working 12 hours a day. And then I think there's like arguments that they were making that, like hard work was why TSMC succeeded, and like younger Americans, their reluctance to work hard is why we lost. It's why America fell behind. I think I follow the logic. Personally, I don't completely agree. I think America succeeded in other ways, that they, like Apple, Nvidia workers, they have a much better life, and then they make more money, and then they successfully outsource the manufacturing part to other places. So I don't think like America is falling behind by not working hard enough. But I see that's kind of like a quite common sentiment. Some people, like, they do believe that this requires working hard, and then there's no like right or wrong answers. Like, would TSMC be the same successful if they are more relaxed on management, if they are less bureaucratic, or like they're less authoritarian, less military? There's no real like comparison there to be made. And then I've heard people who are saying like, yeah, it's like unnecessary bad management, and then there are people arguing like we succeed by being authoritarian. So yeah, like I feel like it's something that's worth discussing.
Yeah, I mean that's the key point, right? Is like TSMC's as a market cap of $600 billion, Apple's 2.5 trillion, Nvidia's 2 trillion. It's better to do design than it is to do manufacturing. Manufacturing sucks. It's really hard, and the salaries have been lower for the past 30 years. And I don't know, like, to what extent Intel falling off is downstream of them not choosing to double down on EUV, or them choosing to like be soft and lazy, or they just weren't able to hire the same talent that they were in the 70s and 80s because there were software and semiconductor design companies that could just pay more. But the fact is, like we do have a TSMC now, which is the unquestioned world leader and is going to continue to be for at least the next few years. And, they're not all idiots at TSMC, I guess is my point. Something has gone right, and it's not just banging your head against a wall. and working, 16 hours a day. There's more magic to that firm than that. And I think, part of what, part of that is this like really great quote that you had at the end from a TSMC employee who was like a little frustrated with the Americans, but it goes like, look, everything comes from working hard. Without this culture, TSMC cannot be number one in the world. I want to support TSMC to be great. It's my religion. And, no offense to Foxconn, but I don't think anyone's calling Foxconn a religion. There is something really kind of magical that ends up happening going from sand to microchips that may at some level take the level of dedication that you're seeing out of out of this employee to really succeed.
I get this pride in East Asian Taiwanese manufacturing. I think there's a generation of people who are really proud of how Taiwan succeeded in that industry. I feel like I really emphasize with even like this, like their loyalty to companies. I see where that come from. And I also understand how Americans have no attachment to their companies at all. I guess it's just like when people are talking about the cultural, I feel a lot of it is actually not like entirely about like, East Asians work harder, they are more willing to put up with stuff, and Americans have a more carefree culture. It's a lot of it is actually economical, that in Asia people do not have that many options. And then because like American companies, they're really, really popular employers in China and in Taiwan, in many Asian countries. People wanted to go to Hawaii, and even like Japanese companies, I feel they are pretty desirable in China. People wanted to have a better life at foreign companies. They don't care about like having to learn English or like having to deal with foreign bosses. So I just like we shouldn't like make this easily about like Asian company culture versus American company culture, and then these are not compatible. I feel eventually all workers, they do want a better life. And then that's universal. And then maybe like Americans, they're just like more privileged enough, so they can't afford making complaints. They can't afford risking getting fired. For Asians, I remember a Taiwanese person saying like, we have to do more because we're not Americans. We are here on a company visa. We cannot jump ship. So it's really about there's like a power dynamic there. You need to have enough options. You need to have that power to be able to complain like Americans.
Yeah, I mean, look, like there's going from the 12-hour to the 8-hour workday was something that happened in America in like the 1950s. And that was because labor had power and they could, bargain and negotiate because there were exit options. And, until that happens in other countries in the world, it's tricky. I mean, even now you're seeing articles in China about like, it's hard to find people to work in factories because like, who the hell wants to, go from go from getting a college degree to like screwing stuff in Zhengzhou for Foxconn. It is like a bit of a stages of development. I did love this beat you had in the Indian story, where you wrote that the expat staff enjoy Indian work culture of tea breaks, chatting with colleagues, and going home on time. They recognize they are helping the company spread a Chinese work culture that they know can be unhealthy. At Foxconn's factories in China, people strive to exceed their targets, sacrifice leave days, and stay late to impress bosses. The Chinese workplace is too neijian, or involuted, several expat employees said. The term, increasingly popular in China, describes the incessant competition in Chinese society and the grinding race to the bottom that, quote, gradually we're bringing neijian to China, joked an engineer. Which is like, this needs to be an office workplace comedy or a documentary or something, because like it's just such a lovely arc of I'm sure it's going to happen in America. I'm sure there were streams of that happening in America too, where the Taiwanese I'm sure the Taiwanese employees would like to see their teenage kids a little bit more, than they were doing in Taiwan as well.
Yeah, I felt like I've met like people have described this like typical TSMC family of like mostly male engineer working 12 hours a day, and then their wives being staying at home moms taking care of children. I felt yeah, there could be a better arrangement in terms of like yeah, both the husband's well-being and in just terms of like gender equality.
Viola, thanks so much for being a part of China Talk.